Well, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure on behalf of the National Science Foundation to welcome the 2023 Alan T. Waterman recipient, Dr. William Anderegg. Dr. Anderegg is recognized for outstanding contributions to climate change science, particularly in advancing the understanding of the sensitivity, vulnerability, and resilience of forests to climate change, and to risk analyses of forest-related climate change solutions to achieve sustainability goals. Bill earned his BA in human biology at Stanford in 2008, followed by his PhD in 2013, also from Stanford. He then conducted 2 postdocs. For the first one, he was a NOAA Climate and Global Change postdoctoral fellow. And then he was an associate research scholar at the Princeton Environmental Institute. In 2015, the University of Utah was fortunate to recruit him, and I know that personally because I was the department chair that was lucky to recruit him and retain him. And he is currently the director of the Wilkes Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy, where he is an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Utah. And he is also one of the friendliest and most collegial faculty on campus. So Dr. Anderegg's research centers around the interaction of ecosystems and climate change, and he studies how drought and climate change affect forest ecosystems, including tree physiology, species interaction, carbon cycling, and bioatmospheric feedbacks. His research spans a broad array of spatial scales from xylem cells to ecosystems and seeks to gain a better mechanistic understanding of how climate change will affect forests around the world. Dr. Anderegg is committed to communicating his work to the scientific community and also to the public. His first publications appeared in 2010, where he was communicating on the importance of communicating climate change. In those short years since 2010, Bill has published over 139 publications, and another one may have popped onto his CV during this introduction. He has been recognized for his extensive work with many different awards, and I won't read them all to you, but I'll give you a few highlights. He received the National Science Foundation Faculty Development Early Career Science Program, the Career Award, an award from the Web of Science. He's a globally highly cited researcher, a Packard Foundation Fellow for Science and Engineering, an early career fellow of the Ecological Society of America. And on Monday and Tuesday of next week, he'll be in New York receiving the Blatt-Batnick Award. So I ask you all in giving a warm welcome to Dr. William Anderegg. Bill?
Thank you so much, Denise, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for attending today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And thank you to NSF for setting up this incredible lecture series. I feel very, very honored to share with you all about a lot of the research that we do in my group and some of the challenges that Earth's forests are likely to face in a rapidly changing climate. So I'm going to jump right in. So what I want to do today is just give a very general overview of what do Earth's forests face in the 21st century in a rapidly changing climate. And then I'm going to tell you 2 broad themes around our research. One is around using ecophysiology of how plants respond to climate, particularly through the water transport system, to really to improve our understanding of how plants are likely to respond to climate change from tissues to ecosystems. And then I'll jump into a somewhat more recent vein in our research of how can we bring some of this key mechanistic science to bear on policy relevant solutions and how forests can contribute to nature-based climate solutions. So, of course, the motivation for our research is that on our blue-green marble floating in space, we are dramatically changing the climate. Human emissions of greenhouse gases are driving temperatures to rise, and this is going to have profound impacts on societies and on Earth's ecosystems. Now, Earth's forests, this is a photo of the Amazon rainforest taken at dawn. Earth's forests are simply incredible. They support the vast majority of the planet's terrestrial biodiversity. They provide immense benefits to humanity through ecosystem goods and services, things like clean water, clean air, tourism, timber, and fuel. And currently, at least, they are dramatic brakes on the speed of climate change. Earth's forests currently take up about a quarter of the CO2 that humans put up every year. And this is an immense benefit to slowing the speed and severity of climate change. But one of the driving questions in the field is, will they continue to do so in the 21st century? And right now, our understanding and the scientific uncertainty is quite high. And that's because Earth's forests, with respect to climate change, are really perched on a knife edge between two opposing sets of forces. On one hand, on the beneficial side, rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere can benefit plants and let them do more photosynthesis and potentially grow more and continue or even expand that carbon sink in the 21st century. But on the other hand, the stresses of climate change, things like temperature, drought, wildfires, and pests and pathogens, can overwhelm the benefits of CO2 and drive forest loss, widespread forest die-off events, and rising mortality rates that can actually push forests to lose carbon to the atmosphere and thereby accelerate the speed and severity of climate change. Now, these are two end-member scenarios, and really when and where each of these mechanisms will dominate is a critical challenge for the field to unravel in the coming years. And it's worth highlighting that this will affect the speed of climate change pretty dramatically. So this is a really nice summary of a number of our Earth system models that have a terrestrial ecosystems component in them. And it's looking at the change in land carbon storage of all ecosystems, although forests are going to be the biggest piece of this, over the 21st century in two different climate scenarios. So a very low climate change scenario is in blue, and a high climate change scenario is in red. And you can see the thick line is the mean across many of these models, but the spread, the envelopes, are giving us the range in these different model simulations. This is our current best understanding of the potential future of Earth's forests, and it ranges massively. This 300 petagrams of carbon is this enormous uncertainty, anywhere from an expansion and a continuing of the land carbon sink and this really high uptake and increase in land carbon storage, to a dramatic loss in carbon storage and across ecosystems, and this would dramatically accelerate the speed of climate change. Now, unfortunately, this is not just models, and it is not just hypothetical. We are actually seeing climate impacts play out around us, in many cases more rapidly than we might have expected 5, 10, 20 years ago. We're seeing extreme fire seasons, severe drought, and insect-driven tree mortality in forests around the world, including wet and dry forests. And so this is a cause for concern that we really need to have a rigorous scientific understanding of both the benefits of CO2 and the stresses of climate change on forests, and to really build tools that society can plan for these different potential futures. So I see our challenge in the field really as this. We want to be able to capture how responses will occur to the main global change drivers, particularly CO2, climate stress, disturbances and how humans affect ecosystems and the interactions among these drivers. We ideally want this foundation for a predictive global ecology to be built on these first principles of plant physiology, evolution, and ecology. And we have this immense challenge of scaling as well, that we want a lot of these first principles can be developed at a cellular or tissue scale, things like an individual leaf. We need to be able to scale that up to a whole tree response, and then scale from trees to communities and ecosystems, and scale that ultimately up to continents and the globe. And then the second challenge is really scaling in time. So a lot of these processes that we can measure, like the photosynthesis or water loss rates in leaves, we measure and model that on the scale of seconds to minutes. And we need to be able to scale that to seasons, years, and ultimately decades in order to capture a lot of the transient, non-equilibrium, and frequently non-linear responses to stresses that we see out in the real world. Now, this is an enormous challenge. It's a challenge for the whole field, and it really takes a combined effort of hundreds or thousands of research groups around the world. And I would add that there's one final step to this, which is that as we develop this predictive understanding of forests and global ecology, we also need to be thinking about how this can be used in the real world and partnering with groups and developing tools so that this scientific understanding actually can inform solutions, inform communities, and inform policy in the 21st century. So what my group aims to do is really tackle this around three central questions. First, how can we improve the predictions of how individual trees respond to climate using fundamental principles in physiology and ecology? And we focus most on plant water transport called plant hydraulics. Then second, how do we scale these tree responses up to ecosystems and ultimately the globe? And finally, how can we leverage this mechanistic understanding and these tools to actually inform decision makers? And we've been thinking about this most in the space of nature-based climate solutions. And I will define and get into those a little bit later in the talk. I see what we do is really kind of three broad pillars. We work on the ecophysiology of plant climate responses at scales from tissues up to plants. And that's really, I think, understanding what are the key processes that matter and the key functional traits that can capture that physiology. And then the scaling up to whole ecosystems, often using larger data sets like models and remote sensing. And then finally, bringing these tools to bear on nature-based climate solutions. Now, I wish I had enough time to talk about all the really neat projects that the wonderful scientists in my lab are doing. But in the goal of keeping a fairly compact story to tell you, I'm mostly going to tell a quick story from the second category, and then two quick stories from the third category. So I want to jump into this second category. We've worked quite a bit on trying to advance our models of how plants take up carbon and lose water. And this fundamental trade-off happens at this pair of cells on leaf surfaces called stomata. And these are incredibly important for how plants respond to climate, for productivity in ecosystems and in agricultural systems, and they feed back to the atmosphere and affect things like weather patterns and precipitation. Because we still lack a detailed mechanistic understanding, we've been pushing forward quite a bit on developing evolutionary optimizations of how these pores ought to respond, how open or closed should they be in different environmental conditions. And we proposed an optimization hypothesis that was quite well supported by data from plants around the world. And that's what this graph is showing you here, that on the x-axis, we have how open or closed these pores are predicted to be by the theory. And then on the y-axis, we have the actual modeled stomatal conductance from these 34 species from different biomes. And I would say that these models of how stomata behave seem to work remarkably well at a cell or really tissue level. And work done by a former postdoc in my group, Martin Venturas, really tried to test this at an individual tree level using aspen trees in a common garden. And you can see on the right hand, this is kind of a very a schematic of this individual tree level model that was first developed by Joan Sperry. And then in the center, we have our measured versus modeled set of a whole suite of plant responses, things like photosynthetic rate, sap flow, leaf temperature, and water loss from leaves. And again, I would say that these models work remarkably well at the individual tree level, but you'll notice there's an asterisk there. And the key piece is that this is in a controlled setting where we're able to keep the soils and minimize the effects of biotic agents or complexity in topography and hydrology. So one of the things we wanted to ask is, can we take this tree level model and understand and try to make some hindcasts of tree mortality in the Western US? So we took this long-term data set of forest inventory plots, forest inventory and analysis, FIA plots, of monospecific forests from 8 dominant Western US species. And we used this same tree level model at a stand scale to simulate drought impacts over this period using weather and climate data. And then finally, we built these statistical models of mortality using a suite of stand and climate data and the mechanistic stress coming from this model. So what we found, and this is not that surprising, but what we found is, of course, that stand factors were quite important for mortality models, things like the age and the density of the forest. That's classic forestry findings, but also that climatic variables and hydraulic stress were included in the top 5 most important variables. So these really did matter in predicting tree mortality in these Western US forests. And when we added in this mechanistic simulation of water stress, of plant hydraulic stress, it did improve mortality prediction in most all species. So this graph is showing you the drop in this information criteria, where a decline of 3 or more is considered a substantial improvement in the model. Now, how well could we do? This is really a good news, bad news story. I think the good news is that the variance explained, the prediction across all species was really remarkably decent. About 52% of the variance explained in these tree mortality patterns. Now, the bad news is that's for all species. I would emphasize that predicting tree mortality from climate stress like drought is still incredibly hard, and there's a lot more work that we need to do. So if we then break this out by specific species, I've now broken it out by the common names, and you can see that even in species where we know from previous work that there's been a huge amount of drought impacts and drought-driven tree mortality. For example, here in the top center column, you see trembling aspen, or you can see some of the pinyon pine species, that actually our variance explained in prediction is remarkably low. And that underscores how challenging this is. And in many cases, this is because there are still substantial missing processes and components from this type of model. I would highlight 2 quick ones: a lot of the complexity in hydrology and where these plots are actually found based on what we can get at from climate and remote sensing data. And of course, biotic agents often co-occur and interact with drought stress, and we were not simulating or trying to treat those directly. So there's a lot of work still to do in this space. And now, with the rest of my talk, I'm going to dive into some of the recent work we've been doing on how can we bring this ecophysiology and these ecological models to inform nature-based climate solutions in forests. What are nature-based climate solutions? It's really a broad set of strategies, and the key thing I want to highlight is These are human actions in forest systems. And their goal of all of these is really to take up more carbon and thereby slow the speed of climate change. The most common ones that you've probably heard about in various contexts are avoiding the loss of forests, avoiding deforestation, reforesting areas, or restoring areas, and that's things like tree planting campaigns. And then a number of other common ones are improving or changing the management of forests to store more carbon, same with plantations, and agroforestry is trees and agricultural agents. Now, there are lots of reasons why forests are incredible, and one of the reasons why nature-based climate solutions are exciting is they do bring these substantial co-benefits in biodiversity and in ecosystem services. So there's a lot of reasons that we want forests on the landscape, but the key piece in nature-based climate solutions is that this is driven by climate goals, by climate policy. And thus there's been this huge interest, really, I would say this explosion of interest from companies around the world and from governments at both national and subnational scales to try to include some of these nature-based climate solutions in their net zero targets and net zero commitments. So this is entering into the climate policy space in a very rapid way, often through the use of things like carbon offsets. And I'll loop back to that in a little bit. Now, if we're going to use forests to help slow the speed of climate change as part of active management and part of a policy, there's really 4 things that these forest projects must do to be effective, to actually accomplish the goal of slowing the speed of climate change. First, these changes have to cool the climate on net. And what that means is we all think that we're all familiar with that forests take up CO2 out of the atmosphere and can lock that CO2 up in somewhat slower pools like stems or in soils. But forests also interact with the atmosphere and with the radiative budget in other complex ways. And one of the most important ones is the reflectivity or albedo of the surface. And there are plenty of places on Earth's surface where putting more trees out, particularly dark trees over very bright soils like semi-arid regions or snow-covered soils, can actually warm the climate more than the benefits of storing CO2. So we have to be careful that we're encouraging forests in areas where it actually delivers the climate benefits. Second, we have to make sure that these forest approaches lead to additional carbon storage and are not just taking credit for things that would have happened otherwise. Third, there's a key need to account for the shifting of activities that happen in response to these nature-based climate solutions. And a good way to think about this is if we want to protect trees in a given area, and that just drives the timber harvest and the loss of those trees or the deforestation to a different parcel or a different country next door, then we've dramatically weakened the effects or canceled the effects of those actions. And then finally, because the carbon in the atmosphere stays there for such long periods of time, we have to grapple with and in some manner fundamentally address the risks to forests, the risks to forest stability, or often called durability of forests, so that if we protect forests in a given area today, and then it burns down next year, we haven't accomplished the climate goal that we've sought out to do. So how do we move? We've been working in particular on the kind of second and fourth of these, and I'm going to talk mostly about this fourth piece moving forward. How do we move towards this rigorous risk assessment of forests? Well, what we know from the literature quite broadly is that these climate risks to forests are non-stationary, and many of them are increasing in the 21st century. That they vary enormously over space. So this figure on the right shows the integrated 100-year risk of severe wildfire, and that on average has doubled across the US between this first part of the record, 1984 to 2000, and the second part of the record, 2001 to 2017. we can start to estimate these risks using historical data and model future risks. And I think it's quite clear that really rigorous estimates of climate risks are important for land management decisions, but also climate policy through carbon finance and carbon offsets mechanisms. And finally, that really publicly available and reproducible open science maps, data sets, and tools are urgently needed to guide decisions in this space. So I want to tell you 3 quick stories from some of the work we've been doing, and they really set out to answer these 3 questions. What are the main climate risks in US forests, and how do they vary spatially? How do these risks affect future projections of forest carbon in the US? And both in the US and around the globe, do different scientific methods or different models of carbon projections give similar or diverging answers about the future of our forests and the carbon they store? So in this first project, we sought to model really 3 broad categories of disturbances in US forests using historical data. For wildfire, we developed models from the MTBS data, which is a remote sensing data set of, in our case, moderate and severe wildfires. For climate stress and insect risks, and climate stress here is mostly drought, we modeled this from the same long-term Forest Service data set, the FIA data. And we built these forest type models from climate, forest age, and a key physiological trait of drought stress tolerance that comes out of this plant ecophysiological work that we and others have done. This involved downscaling a number of our Earth system models to 4-kilometer resolution. And then we used 3 different climate scenarios ranging from a low to moderate, which is this SSP 245, all the way up to a high climate change scenario, SSP 585. And then we only did future projections where we actually had high historical cross-validated performance in the models. So what do our results look like? Here on the left set of, or the left column of these graphs, these are the observed risks from fire at the top, climate stress in the middle, and then insects on the bottom. And then on the right, we have how our models reproduce these things. White areas here mean that there's not enough forest that you have any data. We have a forest mask, with the one exception of Wyoming, because there wasn't FIA data in the observed record in panels C and E. What you can see here, the big take-home point is not a terribly large surprise, but fire risks are certainly highest in the Western US and in California. Drought and insect risks are really impactful in the Intermountain West. And this is the cross-validated performance of these models. And what you can see that these statistical fire models do a remarkably good job in capturing both spatial and temporal patterns in fire in the historical record. Insect models are kind of an intermediate of this R-squared of 0.3, and then underscoring how challenging capturing the drought stress that had kind of the lowest performance in these models in our cross-validation. Now, if we go forward into the future, I've pulled out 4 different regions in the US, and this is looking at these same 3 stresses in 3 different climate scenarios. So green is this low to moderate emission scenario up to the high emission scenario. Key things to highlight are that wildfire goes up in many areas, even in some areas where it's not terribly common now. And then climate stress mortality really tends to rise in our model substantially in the Western US and in the Southwest. And insect mortality also rises in that region and in California. So a couple considerations and caveats to consider here is that these are empirical or statistical models, and there are a number of pieces that are not included in them. I think some of the key ones are, of course, fuel limitations to feed back to affect fire, and then land management and disturbance interactions. But still, despite this, I think there's a number of reasons why these risk projections could be over or underestimates, that many of these mechanisms could push these numbers higher or lower. And we've really, we've teamed up with a set of collaborators from the nonprofit Carbon Plan to really make sure that all of this data and code is publicly available, and built a really neat web tool that you can go and fly around and look at these data sets and base decisions on them. In the second vignette, we wanted to take this now a step further. So the last project was really about the disturbance risks themselves, these climate sensitive disturbances. Now let's get to the carbon. Do we expect more or less carbon in US forests? This was led by a postdoc in my group, Chao Wu. And we took three broad approaches, which I think of as kind of the most common approaches that we use to model climate impacts on ecosystems, particularly at these large scales. First are these mechanistic vegetation models that are found in our Earth system models. These are trying to simulate things from first principles and equations of things like photosynthesis, respiration, allocation. We used about 30 of those models in the CMIP6 model intercomparison project. Next, using the disturbance models from the previous project, we built a simple demographic model that grows trees that's sensitive to climate, and then imposes this stochastic and disturbance of these three disturbances. And then finally, really drawing from tools widely used in the conservation literature, we use these niche model or species distribution model approaches. We built these random forest models of the total carbon in vegetation, and then also broke it out by 24 major forest groups and modeled the carbon in those forest groups. And just for a connection to some of the policy pieces, we'll look at some of the existing forest offset projects in California's compliance cap and trade market. So, is the future of forests in the US likely to be carbon gain or carbon loss? What we found was this varied enormously by the tool or the method that you looked at it. First, these are the mechanistic vegetation models, which you see actually tend to project, this is the multi-model median, but tend to project increases of carbon in most everywhere in the US, except for a small section in Texas, and about a 45% increase in carbon. I should have mentioned this is at the last 2 decades of the 21st century, 2081 to 2100, compared to the historical window in these simulations, 1995 to 2014. This is not terribly surprising given that these models have a relatively strong effect of CO2 in stimulating growth, but in many cases don't capture the climate stresses terribly realistically in terms of fire, drought, and insects that I mentioned. In the niche models of carbon, you actually see the other end of the spectrum, about a 4% loss in carbon across the whole US, and really substantial losses in both the eastern and western US. And then in this demographic model, which is trained on, I think, the most data on US forests, you see a slight gain overall of about 4%, and patterns that I think align a lot more with recent literature of some carbon gains in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, and carbon losses in the Intermountain West and in California. And then this bottom panel, D, is showing us the average of these different models, with the hatching showing where all three methods agree on the sign. So we might think of those hatching areas as where we have more confidence in the direction, or in at least the sign change of carbon in US forests. Just to overlay this on the carbon offset projects as an example, and I want to drill in particular on this growth mortality or demographic model. That this map shows you the plots that are, the projects that have been put in, and green projects gain carbon over the 21st century, and the gray projects are expected to lose carbon in these models. And the middle histogram is by the number of projects, and the right histogram is really by the area covered in projects. And in this estimate, I think if I had to place a bet on the most likely sense, this analysis highlights about 36% of the area in these projects is expected to lose carbon. And that's substantially higher than the insurance pools that these programs often have. I also want to mention, this is the low to moderate climate change scenario. So these forest offset projects are at really substantial risk of carbon losses, even in this lower climate scenario. Then finally, we wanted to take this to a global scale. And so we did a somewhat similar analysis to try to do a global risk analysis for Earth's forests, using these same three broad approaches. So first, we're now going to look at these same Earth system models. And we looked at the number of models with carbon losses and the change in tree fraction for models that report that. We used this disturbance approach of data deriving from the Landsat satellite of stand clearing disturbances in protected areas, and then a separate data set of looking at stand clearing disturbances globally, trying to remove land conversion. And we related this to the climate sensitivities and used those same climate models to estimate a rough future potential change in disturbances. And then finally, we used this same niche or species distribution model approach, but coming from three recent studies that quantified this at a global scale. The first two looked at transitions among ecoregions, and the third was really looking at the loss in species richness. So let's take the mechanistic models first. In these CMIP models, you can see the change in carbon in vegetation here on the left, which again, we're seeing on average increases in carbon. Areas that are hatched out in gray are where there's enough land use change that we've removed that to avoid the land use, hopefully the land use contamination signal. But the thing I want to highlight is that on this right-hand map, the range, which gives us a sense of the uncertainty across models, is incredibly high in many biomes. In many cases, the range is much bigger than the mean change, if you look at the units there. And then let's look at our two risk metrics. So our two risk metrics from these models on the lower left are the number of models projecting carbon losses. And on the lower right are the change in tree fraction. And in these analyses, you really do start to see parts of tropical forests and parts of the southern boreal forest jump out as much higher risk. Here are the three different niche model projections. So the top two are the percentage of ecoregions or percentage of a given ecoregion likely to transition to a different ecoregion. And then the bottom one is the effect size of species richness loss. And then on the right are the disturbance models. And these are the expected change in the percent of an area disturbed in future climate. Now, there's a lot of maps here. I'm going to try to synthesize and put these all together. These are all different approaches and they yield estimates of risk in very different units. And so the main way that we looked at comparing these is looking at the percentiles of risk, going from lowest to highest percentile of risk. And then we looked at the spatial correlation in patterns of risk across these different data sets. Again, this is another good news, bad news story on the science piece. Let's start with the good news first. The good news here is really on this left map, which is there are specific regions that are consistently at higher or lower risk in comparing across all 7 of these data sets. In particular, a lot of the drier areas in the Amazon and areas in the southern boreal forest, for example, in North America, really jump out as being at much higher risk on average. And some areas are consistently in lower risk, like the northwestern Amazon. Now, the bad news part of this, which emphasizes, I think, still how much there is to do in this space, is that the correlation matrix on the right, actually, we didn't find any statistically significant correlations in the global spatial patterns across these data sets. And actually, the mechanistic models here, these top 2 rows of this correlation matrix, were often negatively correlated with the other risk approaches. So just to tie all these different pieces together, I think that really bridging scales between what we measure at a tissue or plant level and an ecosystem response to climate change is challenging, but I think we're getting the tools and a lot of the mechanistic understanding, particularly around plant hydraulics, this physiology of plant water transport, to start to do this and really improve our models at these larger scales. Second, these nature-based climate solutions in forests really urgently need better data and consideration of those 4 key pieces that I mentioned. And in particular, I think science is really well suited to try to provide better estimates of at least 3 of them, particularly the risk to durability or permanence, the net climate effects, and also the additionality. And then finally, I hope I've convinced you that the climate risks to Earth's forests and to their carbon storage potential are pretty substantial. They're uncertain, and they're widely underestimated in current policies relating to forests. And I see this as an enormous call to action to the scientific community to really try to step in and provide useful and actionable information to help inform decision makers and help inform policy. And I want to then put in a quick plug for the new center, the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy that we have launched at the University of Utah that has some of that aim of providing cutting edge science into the hands of decision makers. We run an annual climate summit and an international climate solutions prize. And I'd love to see any and all of you join us at that summit, which is held every May. Finally, I want to give an enormous thanks to the wonderful group of scientists that I get to work with each and every day. This is our crew recently in the field in Colorado. These folks are just fantastic, and it's a pleasure to work with all of them. They've done an immense amount of the projects that I showed. And then finally, I want to thank the many collaborators that we've undertaken this work with and the funding sources that have made this all possible. So with that, thank you all, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Bill. I know you can't see anyone but me and maybe a few other people on the webinar, but that was a fabulous talk. I have a few announcements before we roll into the questions. So for the more than 500 people that were in the audience, if you want to tell your friends that a recording of this presentation will be available on the NSF website in just a few days. Once we get it up there, you can share that with people. And then I'll be running the Q&A session. So if you have questions, send them to me, Denise Deering, Division Director of Integrative Organismal Systems, through the Q&A. And I see we have some questions already in there. And I'm going to start off with this icebreaker question from Ed Zipser. Do you know Ed?
I do, yeah.
And he says, I'll try to do my best accent here. What's stomata with the model?
Yeah, as in how are stomata folded into the models is my guess.
Or he wrote that at the time when you were showing that there was variability in the ability of the models to predict for different tree species. So I didn't know if he was trying to get at, is it a difference in the plant's life history, like being an evergreen versus being a deciduous plant? Like, is that what lessens the ability of the model to be predictive?
Okay, yeah. So a whole suite of physiology and life history plays into how stomata behave. And I guess one of the key pieces in these models and in many models in the literature is the physiology of water transport, to pipe water, to extract it from the soil and pipe it up to leaves. And that varies based on, angiosperm, gymnosperm, and this the allocation across tissues and anatomy of the actual cells themselves, the xylem elements. So we see huge variation across species, and this whole community has been quantifying that variation through functional traits for several decades. And so we can really draw upon that variation in building these models. So for example, in our Western US forest models, we used all those functional traits for those major tree species to actually then try to simulate stress and damage. You also have to keep some of the other pieces around the photosynthesis machinery as well, because that's where a lot of the key responses to light and CO2 come in terms of how stomata behave to changing environments.
Great. the questions are just rolling in here, and I can see who's asking some of them. And so for the people from NSF, you'll have another chance to ask Bill questions at 2:30. So if we don't get to your questions, please pop back in at 2:30 using the NSF link. So the second question sort of builds on that first question, and it's from Kabi Raj. How do you address some of the challenges or complexity while scaling tree level model to the landscape level? And I think you addressed some of this. So if you just want to hit the highlights of that.
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. And I think that better data will help in a number of circumstances. This is, I think, an area where the neon measurements can help, where high resolution remote sensing can help. Higher resolution climate data, and actually we were often in many of these cases using 4 kilometer or 800 meter climate data. And in mountainous terrains, that's a huge level of averaging, even still at 800 meters. I do think that we need this kind of fusion of better data and better models to do that. And to some extent, I think having the more precise locations of the plots, which is where I think kind of better open science and engaging with some of these networks to make sure all that data is available for research, is a key need.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So this question comes from Marn Kilpatrick, and it's about soil color. So although planting trees where soil color is light in arid regions, or where there is snow, could lead to warming due to absorbing radiation from the sun, it could still increase CO2 uptake. So they want to know, what is the net effect on global temps of less CO2 but lower albedo with forests in these regions where planting trees decreases albedo?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. There are a number of modeling analyses that have been done, and now we're starting to see more observation-based analyses. You still have to have a model in some extent to capture the effects of albedo. But broadly speaking, this is kind of acknowledging that there is a lot of complexity around how much snow cover there is, what types of trees, whether it's conifer trees or deciduous trees, the density of trees, there's complexity there. But broadly speaking, adding more tree cover in boreal or Arctic or high snowpack systems and really reflective soils in many semi-arid regions. Unfortunately, this means a lot of places I love in the southwestern US, for example, does on net tend to heat the planet in the studies that have been done. Now, so I guess the way of phrasing this is, in order for this to be effective for the climate, we want the right trees at the right places. And we need to use a lot of these data sets about albedo and this net effect between CO2 uptake and these other biophysical feedbacks to try to plan and guide these tree planting campaigns so that we get the right trees in the right places to benefit the climate. It's not everywhere. There's large swaths of Earth's surface where it doesn't make a lot of sense.
And just a follow-up on that, are native trees usually better in this respect, or are there cases in where a non-native tree would outperform a native tree?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think that usually with most of these tree planting efforts, there's a large push towards native trees for other reasons, for the biodiversity ecosystem service benefits. I don't know that we can categorically say if native trees are better or worse. I think it really depends.
Okay. We have a lot of questions. We probably won't get through them all. So another question is, would you please comment on the role of thermodynamics in this project?
Sure. Well, so all of these mechanistic models are really modeling the thermodynamics in many cases directly to, for example, to capture the stomatal behavior. We model the energy budget of individual leaves and of canopies directly, because things like the temperature of the leaf obviously are a product of that energy budget, and they matter immensely. And the plant behavior feeds back to affect the thermodynamics. So opening stomata drives more water loss, and that has this energy effect. And in the global models of the Earth system and climate, thermodynamics are really the bedrock. They're a core piece of the atmosphere and ecosystem and oceans. I think that there's an exciting need for really kind of fusing this cutting edge plant physiology into these physically realistic and thermodynamically consistent models. And I'm excited to see a lot of the developments that have happened there in the past couple of years.
Great. I'm going to paraphrase this next one. It has to do with fire and whether you're including in your models the fire suppression policies of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the models that we've done implicitly include some of that because it's captured in the fuels and the biomass that exists currently on the landscape, which is a product of all this past land management and fire suppression. Capturing future behavior and fire management is challenging, and we haven't been doing that in our models that I showed, but there are efforts to do that in the field. You know, maybe just to take a quick step back on the kind of net wildfire risk in the Western US, there certainly is a role for the effects of past land management and fire suppression, and there's a role for climate change and in these long-term trends in fire that we've seen in the Western US. And some of my favorite analyses have estimated that it's roughly split half and half, that about half the area burned in the Western US can be attributed to climate change, and half is due to all of these other human factors like land management.
Interesting. So we have another question that's not so much on the science, but on communicating the science. And I'm going to paraphrase this one. And it's from Beth Covett, and they are interested in understanding how you are thinking about making sense and communicating around scientific uncertainty and risk to decision makers.
Yeah, communicating uncertainty and risk and providing useful information, I think is a key challenge. There's a couple tools that I think are really valuable for this. So the first is really clearly communicating what the levels of confidence that we have and where there's really robust agreement on key points, I think is important. Lead with what we know, not with what we don't know. And that's often the opposite of what scientific talks do. Second, I think using scenarios is incredibly important. So we can use different scenarios of climate, different scenarios of land management. And that scenario approach can make it really concrete of, we think if we do these actions, this is the most likely outcome. And then the third, this really comes from one of my mentors, Steve Schneider, is the use of metaphors, that we can really simplify complex dynamics to their key essence using metaphors without losing some of the accuracy of those statements.
Great, well, thank you. So we have a question from Matt Kane, who's here at the NSF, and he's curious about the usefulness of the National Ecological Observatory Network in predicting carbon trends in forests, and which measurements might be most likely to be important from NEON. And I don't know how familiar you are with all the measurements that
I'm moderately familiar. Yeah, I think that, so on certainly the flux data, and I'm thinking in particular about the role of potentially constraining and improving our mechanistic models, the fluxes of carbon and water and the isotopes, and a lot of those kind of detailed ecosystem measurements really help. I should say one huge and neat piece of NEON is connecting the organismal and community level measurements up to the ecosystem scale. And so there's a lot of really amazing ecosystem flux measurements out there from Ameriflux and other networks, but often it's not terribly well documented what the species composition and the distribution of stand structures and the understory species. And that's a gap, right? If we want to go from the physiology of individual plants and who's there to the ecosystem scale, those community level and population level measurements really matter. And that's one piece I'm quite excited about for NEON. I will say the scaling over the spatial complexity using things like the airborne platforms, I think are also another really promising piece, that we can take our site level measurements and then look at ecosystem properties over space. And I'm also quite excited about that.
Great. Well, we have time for a couple more questions. So I think this is a question on lots of people's minds for different reasons. What role does artificial intelligence play in improving the predictability of your models?
Yes, this is something I've been very interested in thinking about. My sense is that artificial intelligence is going to really help us in pattern recognition and diagnostics, so understanding and picking out patterns in ecological data sets over space and time. And I think what a lot of these AI tools are very good at is taking an intense amount of data in and trying to distill out the kind of key patterns that we want to be able to understand and to model going forward with climate change. So that's the upshot. I think the downshot is I don't see as useful a role of AI in getting us to the mechanistic understanding or the future forecasting and projection, because I think maybe in the near term, we could see AI forecasts on kind of early warning systems or the next few years. But if we think about the full 21st century, that I think has to come from the fundamental mechanisms in physics and biology. So I would say there are some exciting promises, but there are also likely to be limits that AI is not going to solve this uncertainty for us.
All right, well, we'll stay tuned for the role of AI. So the last question, and I'm hoping you can answer this in the minute we have left. Bill Cooper would like to know if you've tried to integrate mycorrhizal fungal carbon storage into your models.
Yeah, it's a super neat area. We have not done it in our modeling, which is really kind of focused on the climate stress, but I think there are a number of groups trying to do that. And my sense is that there's a couple of key pieces we need to know, which is first, how much mycorrhizal partners help in this resource acquisition, especially in dry and stressful conditions. And then second, this carbon allocation question. So how much carbon is passed to these partners across different trees and phylogenetic diversity, and solving that internal carbon allocation question in trees, both to mycorrhizae and to different tissues, is a really important uncertainty that I would love to see more work on.
All right, well, thank you, Bill. There are a ton of questions here that I couldn't get to from people I know all across the country. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to save the questions so that you can see some of the questions. And there are also many comments congratulating you on the award. And so with that, I would like to congratulate you one more time. Congratulations on the Waterman Award. And for the NSF folks here, if you want to come back at 2:30, Bill will be around for more discussion. Thank you all for your time, and we'll hope to capture the questions so that you can see them, Bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful, and thanks for coming, everyone.